On May 31st, 1889, at about 3:10 p.m., the South Fork Dam failed above Johnstown, Pennsylvania. In the hours that followed, more than 2,200 people would be dead, and a proud working valley would look like it had been scraped clean. Survivors said the sound came first, a low roar that didn't belong to any storm. So how did a private lake in the hills become the force that erased a mill town in minutes? That morning, Johnstown still sounded like Johnstown. The steel works along the rivers throbbed and clanged, and smoke hung in the valley the way it often did in the late 1800s. Men worked long shifts, and families planned their day around the mills and the weather. Even with rain in the forecast, the town's routine felt ordinary, like it always did. Then the rain stopped being weather and became a problem with weight. By the afternoon of May 31st, water had filled streets in the low parts of town and pressed up against doorsteps. People watched the little Conemaugh and Stony Creek rivers climb and run fast, brown with runoff. A few families began carrying bundles uphill, but many stayed, because Johnstown had flooded before, and life had always come back. 14 miles upstream, the water was gathering behind an old earthen dam and a wide reservoir people called Lake Conemaugh. Most Johnstown workers never saw that lake, and they had no reason to think about it during a hard week. But on that day, the lake rose toward the top of the dam with every hour of rain. Men at the dam tried clearing the spillway and piling more earth where the crest looked low, working in soaked clothes with little time left. The moment everything turned was simple and brutal. Water ran over the top. An earthen dam can hold a lake safely only as long as the water stays below the crest. Once water overtops, it cuts into the dam like a moving knife, chewing the surface away and lowering the barrier second by second. At the South Fork Dam, the overtopping concentrated at a weak low spot, and erosion began to race faster than any shovel could fix. Warnings were sent, but they moved slowly through a valley already breaking apart. A messenger rode to a telegraph station, and operators tried to relay the message downstream. But lines followed the railroad, and the storm had already damaged tracks and wires in places. Even when a warning reached Johnstown, there was no simple way to spread it to thousands of people across flooded streets. When the dam finally gave way, the lake did not become a gentle flood. It became a moving wall of water, loaded with debris, rolling down the river channel and growing heavier as it went. Trees, timbers, and entire structures were pulled in and carried along, turning the surge into a battering ram. Some witnesses later said it barely looked like water at all, but like a dark mass that carried a town inside it. The valley itself helped the destruction keep its speed. Johnstown sat in a steep bowl of hills, and the river followed a narrow path that forced the surge into tighter space. At one railroad viaduct, debris jammed and water piled up briefly, creating a temporary dam. When that jam failed, the flood surged again with renewed force, as if it had taken one breath and charged forward. By the time the wave neared Johnstown, it was moving at terrifying speed and carrying the tools of its own violence. Rail cars, scrap metal, and coils of barbed wire were swept into the flow from industrial yards along the way. The narrowing valley acted like a funnel, pushing the surge higher and tighter. People who heard the roar and saw debris racing ahead understood in that instant that this was not a routine flood. Johnstown's first problem was time, and the second was confusion. Trains were stranded by washed-out tracks, and people who might have left the valley were stuck where they stood. Some residents had heard the dam might break warnings before during heavy rains and learned to doubt them. On May 31st, that doubt stole precious minutes that the town would never get back. The flood struck the city and broke apart around buildings and streets, rushing into the flat downtown and slamming into anything that stood in its path. Homes that had been solid in the morning were lifted, twisted, and pushed away by force no human body could resist. In places, the water rebounded off hillsides and surged back through the same blocks, sweeping loose debris into new directions. The mills that had defined the valley went silent, replaced by an eerie quiet broken only by shouts and cracking wood. Downstream of the town, a stone railroad bridge became a choke point, and the ruins of Johnstown began to pile against it. The jam grew into a field of wreckage, and survivors who had clung to boards or rooftops found themselves trapped in a shifting pile of timber and broken houses. Rescuers climbed onto the debris, pulling people out by hands and sleeves, listening for voices. Then somewhere within that pile, a fire started, and smoke rose over waterlogged ruins as evening came on. Only after the worst hours passed could the valley begin counting what it had lost. Bodies were carried far downstream, and many victims could not be identified. Thousands of homes were destroyed, and whole families vanished from the town's memory in a single afternoon. The hardest part for survivors was that the world they knew, streets, landmarks, neighbors, no longer lined up with the ground under their feet. Relief arrived as soon as lines and rails could be reopened, and it came from across the country. Clara Barton and the American Red Cross reached Johnstown in early June 1889 and stayed for months, helping organize shelter and aid. Donations and supplies moved into a town that had become isolated by broken bridges and mud-choked roads. Johnstown rebuilt because workers returned to work, neighbors helped neighbors, and the valley refused to disappear. Now the question people asked, then and now, was why there was a giant reservoir above the town in the first place. Decades earlier, Pennsylvania built the dam for a canal system that needed steady water during dry months, a practical solution for the transportation of its day. Then, railroads replaced canals, and the dam became an orphaned piece of infrastructure, still enormous but no longer central to business. Eventually, the lake became a private retreat for wealthy club members who wanted clean air, fishing, and quiet, far from industrial smoke. That shift mattered, because it changed how risk was treated. The rebuilt dam had less ability to lower water quickly, and the spillway was the main path for excess flow during storms. Decisions made for convenience, like keeping fish in the lake and maintaining a high water level for recreation, reduced the safety margin that a storm demanded. And when inspections and warnings appeared, they were too easy to ignore, because the danger felt distant from the people enjoying the lake. The Johnstown flood also left an uncomfortable lesson about accountability. Lawsuits followed, but the club's wealth and the era's legal standards allowed responsibility to slip away, often described as an act of God. Public memory did not agree, because people understood that nature may bring rain, but people decide what structures can endure it. In the decades that followed, the flood became a measuring stick for American disaster planning and a warning about what happens when neglected infrastructure sits above working families. Johnstown is remembered because it was not one mistake. It was a chain, a saturated spring, a relentless storm, an undersized and compromised system for releasing water, and a valley shaped like a funnel waiting at the bottom. One of the most haunting images from afterward shows a house carried far from its foundation and left impaled by a tree, as if the river had signed its work. If you had been in Johnstown on May 31, 1889, what would have made you leave first? Rising street water, a telegraph rumor, or hearing that roar from up the valley?